With spring practices and spring games having been concluded, along with the NFL draft having ended, and the transfer portal immediate eligibility deadline, which was May 1st, having passed, I find it appropriate to release my post-spring top 25. This video is just talking about the current 25 teams who I think are the best 25 teams in the country. It's an updated edition of my top 25 video that I released early this winter, I think sometime in early February. I can't exactly remember. If you want to check out that video, which is now technically outdated, I will link it down below though, so you can get a perspective of some of the changes that occurred, maybe why I moved some teams up and down, etc. If you're new to this channel, I encourage you to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on my top 25 down below. What I got right, what I got wrong, how it measures up to other top 25s, whether it's from ESPN, CBS Sports, 24/7 Sports, or just another YouTubers. Tell me down below. So let's get right into it. We're going to start from first to last. So without further ado, let's talk about number one, Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State is, in my opinion, the best team in the country. They're going to have a 15-0, maybe 14-1, but I'm thinking an undefeated record and win the national championship game. Their schedule is tough by a normal school standards, but it's not that challenging for a school like Ohio State. I think their toughest regular season game is hosting Michigan at home, which I think the Buckeyes will win this year. They have the number one offense in the nation, I think, returning C.J. Stroud, Trevion Henderson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, and getting upgrades at offensive line. Their defense, I didn't think this a few months ago, but they have top 10 potential with new head coach Jim Knowles, Tanner McAllister coming in, and that D-line that includes JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. It's going to be a much improved defense. And Ryan Day as a head coach seems to have this, he has the proper mentality to coach at Ohio State. He's learning a lot. He's just scratched the surface, as Josh Pate said in one of his videos about the potential he has as a head coach. I couldn't agree more with that. And I think he's going to unlock some more of that potential this season. Up next, we have number 2, Alabama. The Crimson Tide, I think, will have a 14-1 record. Again, maybe 13-2 because regular season losses happen. It's hard to go undefeated, but I think the Tide can certainly do it. And I think they'll win the SEC as well. Same with Ohio State winning the Big Ten there. Their schedule, it's an SEC West schedule, but I think the SEC West is going to have overall more of a down year, partially because of just they're all going to be eating each other alive. But Alabama is so much above them in terms of talent. Their offense returns Bryce Young. You get Jahmyr Gibbs from the portal. Same thing with Jeremy Burton, Tyler Harrell. They're going to have a good offense, similar to this past season, but they're going to have an even better defense. Defense, I think, will be number 1 overall in the country, commanded by Pete Golding. Star player, obviously, is linebacker Will Anderson there. And their head coach, not much to explain. It's Nick Saban. This team could very well win the national title and be number 1 in place of Ohio State. Up next, you got the Georgia Bulldogs. Georgia won the national championship this past season. I expect them to once again have an undefeated or near undefeated regular season. I think they lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game, though. Probably lose in the initial round of the playoffs. Though I think they make it due to their schedule, due to their reputation from this previous season. If you go undefeated in the regular season with any SEC schedule, and as long as you play Alabama close, even if you don't play them close, as long as you're dominant in the regular season, like this past year's Georgia, you're probably going to get a playoff spot over some other conference champs, just because of the SEC's reputation. Georgia's offense returns a lot of their production. I look at a guy like Brock Bowers to have an even bigger year than he did this past season. Their O-line should be top 5 for sure. Their defense should reload, like most Kirby Smart teams that have a very solid defense, and I think that Kirby Smart, this could be a year where he could realistically win his second national title. So watch out for Georgia. They're not going anywhere, as most of you know. Number 4, Michigan. These are my Wolverines. I hold them very dear to my heart. I do not think this team is reaching the playoffs. I think they're a top 4 team, but just because they're a top 4 team, there are sometimes teams who are some of the best in the nation where inferior teams get ahead of them in the playoffs. Like Florida State, for example, over TCU or Baylor in 2014. And I think that'll happen this year. Michigan will win every game in the regular season but the Ohio State game, and that because of their weak overall schedule will cost them. Their schedule, which we already talked about, is pretty weak. I think their offense will be one of the best offenses in the nation. I think overall it might be the best rushing offense in the nation. They don't have a good enough passing game to cause damage to some of the most elite top-tier defenses, and this was exposed against Georgia this past season. Their offense should improve. Their defense, losing 9 starters, especially the pass rush, should take a step back. Jim Harbaugh, I feel like he really improved as a head coach this past year, but he's only won 1 Big Ten championship. You have to still hold him to a level that he's only won something in 1 year. So we'll see this year whether he will hold his team back like in years past or whether he's truly changed as a head coach for the better. Number 5, Utah, who I think will make the playoffs and have an unblemished record in a very weak Pac-12. This is the example of a slightly worse team, though I think this team's better than 2014 Florida State, that'll make it over a superior team because of undefeated resume, which does have its place. The games decide things, not my thoughts on them. And I think Utah, despite their weaker schedule, they will waltz through their Pac-12 schedule, in my opinion, with just the talent they have. Tevion Thomas at running back, Cameron Rising. Their offense is going to be phenomenal. It's one of the most versatile in the nation. Their defense had some issues, especially in that secondary, but they were young. From what I've heard, they return a lot of their starters. Losing Devin Lloyd will obviously hurt, but I think the Utes, via the transfer portal and just their amazing coaching, will compensate for that. Kyle Whittingham is one of the top head coaches in the country. He's assembled an amazing staff, like most of the teams on this list have, and that'll certainly help him against a Pac-12 that is very inferior. Just a little note that'll take an extra few seconds. Utah's the only Pac-12 team ranked in this list, by the way. Number 6, BYU, another team from Utah who could have joined the Pac-12 or the Pac-12 would have been interested in if they weren't a religious school. Little extra side note there. Their record, I think, will be 11-1. Maybe 12-0, but their schedule is so tough. I think they have 6, maybe more Power 5 opponents, which I think include the likes of Baylor and Arkansas, who are around that number 10 spot for me. I think their schedule is one of the toughest in the nation by talent they have on their team, but I think they'll do very well. Their offense returns 8 starters. Their defense returns 11 starters. So they're going to be a much improved team from this past season. Their current OC, whose name I forget, was, I think, the QB coach for Zach Wilson. So that should explain where this offense is heading, the direction it's going in. Kalani Sitake, I think that he's an up-and-coming head coach. He's learned how to work BYU, and I think he's finally rebuilt them after having that initial 4 years of just kind of struggling, having 9 and 7 win seasons. BYU's certainly on the right track under him. Don't be surprised if they go undefeated. They could take up that number 4 spot like Cincinnati did this past season. Oklahoma at number 7 is probably another questionable one. I know BYU is shocking, but Oklahoma loses a lot, whereas BYU, returned a lot. But I think Oklahoma is still going to go 11-2. They're going to win the Big 12, I think, or at least be a runner-up. They're still going to be in the top echelon of the Big 12. Their schedule, they have a non-conference game at Nebraska. Their Big 12 schedule doesn't exactly work out in their favor per se, but they're Oklahoma. They have the talent. Bill Biedenbaugh, Cale Gundy, Jeff Lebby on the same offensive staff is going to be a problem. And Brent Venables, I assume he's going to be calling defensive plays, him and Ted Roof. The staff is just going to set this team up for success despite the portal departures. I think Brent Venables, it's year 1. You're going to have some struggles there. You're going to have a learning process, but overall it will be a good experience for Oklahoma Sooner Nation. Number 8, Oklahoma State, the team in the same state as Oklahoma, heated rivals in the Bedlam series, which Oklahoma has dominated, and I think Oklahoma will win that game again. I think Oklahoma State goes 10-2, and they actually, despite being the second highest ranked team in the Big 12, I think they miss their conference championship game due to just how the schedules line up for them. I think Baylor is a slightly worse team than they are, but they have to play at Baylor, and I think that's a close to a 50-50 game that at the end of the day, I have to pick the team with home field advantage in a 50-50 game. That's just kind of how I do it. But 10-2, they're going to have a solid offense, but I think the name of this team is going to be once again the defense. Derek Mason comes in as the DC. From what I understand, they return a lot of that defensive line that was just oh so powerful, could really effectively get to the quarterback. Mike Gundy certainly knows how to do more with less, and I anticipate this is going to be another season where his team will once again exceed expectations. Number 9, Arkansas. Arkansas, they lose a whole lot. This might be one of the teams on this list. This might be the team on the list that loses the most production. I still think they're going to go 10-2, losing to, obviously, Alabama, and I think they play at BYU or face off against, I think BYU. You can tell me down below if that's wrong, but they play at BYU. Their schedule is pretty tough because that additional tough non-conference game in SEC West schedule. But KJ Jefferson, under center, is a guy that you have to trust. He was one of the top quarterbacks in the nation. He's a dual threat. Sam Pittman is another coach who knows how to do more with less. Arkansas is bringing in a top 10 transfer portal class that will fulfill a lot of departures they suffered, most of them off to the NFL. I think Arkansas is in a situation via the transfer portal, Sam Pittman's brilliance and KJ Jefferson's skill set, they're going to reload and be a threat in the SEC West this coming season. Number 10, Nebraska. Now this one is bold, and I can't move Nebraska any higher. They were number 14 in my previous top 25. I can't move them any higher than this just because my doubts with how good of a coach Scott Frost is. But outside of him, you factor him out of the equation. I think this team will go 10-3. They'll be the runner-ups in the Big Ten West. They do have a tough schedule, but it's not as tough as in previous years. The early segment is very easy, and I think that will allow this team to build momentum, build a winning mindset, and they'll get to October, November, the tough stretches, and be very confident with Casey Thompson and Anthony Grant leading an offense that will have some to be desired from, but they're still going to be a very solid, explosive unit with Mark Whipple as the OC. Eric Chenander looks to have another year where his defense improves upon the past season, and special teams errors, I have to mention them because they were huge this past season, I think will be more than fixed. They'll be one of the best special teams units in the Big Ten with who they've brought in. All that set aside, Nebraska, this is definitely a risky pick. I don't know how good of a coach Scott Frost is, but the staff he's assembled and the fact that he has relieved himself from play calling duties is all positive things. So Nebraska, I think they're a team to watch, and I think they're better than a lot of people think they are for this season. Number 11 and number 12 now. Here's Baylor. Baylor is a team that could be in the top 10, and half of my mind wants me to put them in that number 10 spot ahead of Nebraska. The other doesn't. Baylor has a solid squad. Dave Aranda is probably one of the highest IQ'd coaches in the country. He has a lot to learn, but he's learning very quickly. Second year overall as a head coach with no prior head coaching experience and went 12-2. I think they'll go 10-3. They will be second place in the Big 12, and they will lose in probably the Big 12 championship game to Oklahoma as that third loss. Their offense, they have one of the best OCs in the country in Jeff Grimes. Their defense is going to be solid up front. Overall, their trench play is going to be top 5 in the nation or top 10. That includes O-line, D-line, and I already talked about how good of a coach Dave Aranda is, and I think he'll be growing a lot in the coming years. Lane Kiffin is a guy who has had prior head coaching experience, and he struggled. He seems to be blossoming at Ole Miss, though, and I think he's going to go 9-3 this season. You lose Matt Corral and other players, and you lose your DC and OC to other schools, it's tough. But he's brought in the number 2 transfer portal class. You're bringing in Jackson Dart, TCU star running back. Your defense this past season improved tremendously from 2020. I think that Ole Miss is set to have, they're not going to be as good, I think, in the regular season as they were this past year, but they're going to be close. They're just going to take a slight step back. And again, the SEC West, they just have so many solid teams. That's where those 3 losses come from. I think Lane Kiffin is a solid head coach. I don't think that he's one of the best in this list. Still has a lot to learn. Don't know exactly who or what he is, but he's certainly a figure, and he's using his celebrity status to his advantage, especially in the portal. Watch out for him. Number 13, Notre Dame, and number 14, Pittsburgh. Notre Dame has a new head coach in Marcus Freeman, and their schedule is tough. I think they go 10-2, 9-3. They have a neutral site versus BYU. You're starting to see why I think BYU is such a good team with how many Power 5 schools I have them beating. They're going to have a neutral site versus BYU. Their toughest game, though, is opening up at Ohio State. And I think that those are where the 2 losses are. The third loss could come from USC, hosting Clemson, playing North Carolina. They play all these tough teams, but they're a good team. They're a solid unit. I think that despite some of the downgrades they made overall at coaching staff, that with the talent they have and with the fact that their coaching staff is still pretty good nationally, I think that Notre Dame is going to find a way to win 9-10 games, many of them in close fashion, but overall be a solid team with an okay offense, but a solid and talented defense, I would say. Number 14, Pittsburgh. Now, Pittsburgh lost a lot, and you may be thinking, why are they up here with Jordan Addison's departure? Well, I have them going 11-2 and still winning the ACC, even with him leaving, and that's because Pittsburgh, they're in a conference with so many weak teams. The only other teams with great offenses are probably going to be Wake Forest and North Carolina State. I do not have faith in Wake Forest's defense, so that leaves 2 other teams. We'll get to that whole matchup later. But via Clemson beating NC State, I think Pittsburgh will get a favorable matchup in the ACC championship game. And with Pittsburgh having a solid enough offense through incoming transfers, some returning starters, including all the offensive line, and having a strong, vicious front 4, I think that still puts them in a relatively favorable position to win the ACC. Keep in mind, I didn't release this in a video, but I make a top 25 every month, and I had Pittsburgh in the top 10 with Addison. They dropped a lot of spots just because of one single player departuring. So I think Pittsburgh's set for success, and I think Pat Narduzzi is very underrated as a head coach. And speaking of Clemson and NC State, the 2 other teams who I think are good enough to win the ACC, here they are. Clemson, number 15. I think they might have one of the best front 4s in the nation, which Pittsburgh also, you can say that. Very solid defensive line. Despite losses at linebacker and secondary, their defense is just, it's amazing. It looked amazing in the spring game. The offense, on the other hand, still kind of looks atrocious, so that's going to be a storyline to follow. I think that Clemson's going to go 11-2, 1 regular season loss at Notre Dame. Pittsburgh, though, they're going to lose to them in the ACC championship game just because of their questions on offense, and I don't think in this modern era, and you saw it last year when Clemson and Pittsburgh matched up, at the end of the day, it didn't matter how good Clemson's defense was. If they couldn't do anything on offense, their defense eventually broke. And they have an entirely new staff as well. Clemson can reach the playoff, I think, but they'll have to look entirely different from how they looked this past season and in their spring game, which was unimpressive. NC State is also a team who I think could be a sleeper here. They return Devin Leary. They return the majority of their starters. They lose, of course, their star offensive lineman, whose name I forget, in the NFL, very good player. And their defense was sneaky good this past season. They went 9-3. They probably would have gotten their 10th win if UCLA didn't opt out due to COVID reasons in the bowl game. They're a solid team. I think they're motivated by that opt-out too. They feel like they were cheated out of 10 wins. It'll motivate them. Their offense is going to be solid, probably more so good. Their defense isn't going to be the storyline of the year, but it's going to be good enough. Dave Doran, solid head coach once again, as most of these guys are. If you think that's repetitive, it is, because you have to be a good or solid coach, with obviously rare exceptions, of course, like in everything, to be in a top 25. And Dave Doran is certainly that. Their schedule, much like Clemson's, cakewalk. That's why I don't have them losing more games, despite the fact that I don't think they're not really close at the moment to top 10 potential. Number 17, Minnesota. Minnesota, the Golden Gophers, team with, I think, a nine-win record is what I have them at. It's why they're in my top 20. And their schedule is Big Ten West, so it is weaker. But they play at Michigan State. They play at Nebraska. I think the West is going to be deep this season. So their schedule is tougher than what you could see by the naked eye, in my opinion. Their offense is going to be a rush attack. There's questions at quarterback with Tanner Morgan. The offensive line loses a lot of their starters. They have good enough wide receivers, though, and they've brought in some transfers at the O-line that I think that outside of QB, there's not a lot of questions, and tight end. Tight end, I think there's some questions at too. But outside of those two, Minnesota will have a solid offense. Their defense has some questions up front, but their secondary is going to be one of the best in the nation, even with the departure of their secondary coach, who went to be the DC at Rutgers. Joe Rossi is one of the best defensive coordinators in the nation. Their defense was solid this past season. There's no reason to believe that they'll all of a sudden fall off with the amount of returning production at linebacker and secondary they have, along with some incoming transfers to assist them. Number 18, Kansas State. Adrian Martinez, who's pictured behind that Kansas State logo. Many of you think that he is just busted, that he has no future. What I see is an athlete who was in a broken system. That system has been fixed, I think, through massive changes at Nebraska. But when Adrian Martinez has already been through 2 offensive coordinators and a QB coach who he had a strong relationship with, he thought that it would be better to go somewhere else. And I think he chose a proper destination. Him plus Deuce Vaughn will wreak havoc on any defense. Any defense is susceptible to the offensive firepower that Kansas State has. The issue is, can Kansas State formulate a solid enough defense that when their offense goes crazy, they can pull away from some better teams? And I think this is going to be their best year. I think they're going to go 9-3 with that Big 12 schedule that is favorable, but they'll have earned those 9 wins and a place in my top 20. Same thing with Michigan State, except Michigan State's 8-4. A lot of people don't like having 8-4 teams in a top 25, but the Spartans deserve it. They're in the top 20 even, not just top 25. And that's because they're tough schedule. They have one of the toughest schedules in the nation by talent and depth on the roster. I do not think this team is as talented or as deep as some think it is. That doesn't discredit the coaching job, though. In fact, I think it actually emboldens the job that Tucker is doing there. They're going to have a great passing attack. They're going to have a better pass defense than this past season that I'm very confident in. They'll have one of the best run defenses in the nation. Their issue is they'll still have weaknesses in pass defense, and their offensive line has a lot of depth issues. Their running backs aren't Kenneth Walker, and that combined with a tough schedule that includes a road games at Michigan, Penn State, Washington, and home games versus Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ohio State, I think they're going to likely drop 3 or 4 there. But the Spartans are still a solid team, heading in the right direction, as most of us know. Up next, we have number 20, Tennessee. Tennessee, compared to a lot of the teams in front of them, have a much better quarterback in Hendon Hooker. Hendon Hooker is a Heisman candidate. He is a legitimate Heisman threat, and this is not debatable, especially with him bringing Brew McCoy through the portal and him having another one of the top wide receivers in the nation returning. This offense is going to be vicious, especially in their passing attack. They have some questions in their rushing attack. Their defense also has some questions. Josh Heupel's not known to be a defensive guy. Tim Banks, their defensive coordinator, is still relatively new at being the sole defensive coordinator as his team, but still, solid team. I think they'll go 8-4. They'll finish, I have them finishing second in the SEC East. And that Georgia game, I know it's a tough game. It's going to be at Sanford Stadium. Watch out, because what Georgia is losing at their secondary makes them immediately susceptible, along with almost everyone in the country, to Tennessee's offense. Just watch out for Tennessee this year. They could easily finish higher than I have them finishing. Even more so, though, with Cincinnati, and that's partially because their easy schedule. They do have a tough schedule by American Conference standards, because I think Cincinnati plays at Arkansas, so Power 5 non-conference game. But if they go undefeated again, very well could be that fourth team once again, especially with the fact that the American Conference has been the toughest and best group of 5 conference in the past few years. I think their offense is going to take a big step back. They lose quarterback Desmond Ridder. Their defense loses Sauce Gardner, who won as the 4th overall pick. But I have faith in Mike Tressel as a DC. I think he's one of the top DCs in the nation, actually. Just look at the job he did at Michigan State. With a lack of offense there, his defense almost never broke down. Luke Fickell's a solid head coach, and Cincinnati recruiting is slowly beginning to bring in more 4-stars. They could be a talented, not just developed, but a talented force to be reckoned with in a few years. Number 22, Miami. And I think Cincinnati, by the way, is going to win their conference. Go 11-2, have 2 regular season losses, but win their conference over Houston. Miami is going to go 9-3. They play in the Coastal Division. Their schedule is not the toughest in the world. Yes, they play at Texas A&M. Yes, they host Pittsburgh. But outside of that, their schedule is not very tough. It just isn't. But I think Mario Cristobal, he has Tyler Van Dyke. He has Josh Gaddis, who won the Broyles Award. And I have to give him credit for helping Michigan go 12-2 this past season. They have a solid offense, possibly one of the best QBs in the nation. Not like a Hendon Hooker level, still an excellent QB. Their defense will certainly improve as well. Probably under Cristobal, most of his teams have had tough defenses. I expect Miami to be a tough defensive team with good QB play in the 2022 season. Number 23, Purdue. Purdue is interesting because not a lot of people expect big things from Purdue. Purdue is on this list probably by national experts, is what they call themselves. Most of them think Purdue would probably be one of the most volatile teams on this list. I don't think so. And Purdue, I have them going 9-3, finishing 3rd in the Big Ten West, I think. Purdue's schedule is relatively easy, though. They pick Penn State from the Big Ten East, who I don't even have as ranked, and I have them going 7-5. So that's an easy Big Ten East matchup game they have, along with their game at Indiana. Their schedule is one of the easiest in the Big Ten. They return QB Aiden O'Connell. Their defense was sneaky good this past season. I think it allowed under 30 points per game. And when Aiden O'Connell doesn't get turnover heavy, he just tears you up, and it doesn't matter. Look what he did against Tennessee. Look what Purdue did against Tennessee in their bowl game this past season without Jackson Anthrop, George Karlaftis, and without David Bell. Without their 3 best players, they still beat a solid SEC team with a bright future. Purdue's going to ride off that momentum and have one of their best regular seasons ever in 2022. Houston, number 24, they return quarterback Clayton Tune, the majority of their production. My main question is with just Dana Holgorsen as a head coach. That's where my main question with this team is, and if he's going to hold them back. Because I don't know enough about him or Houston. I know that his success at West Virginia was pretty limited and such. But Houston, this past season, they were a good team. They held with Cincinnati for a few quarters. And they went, I think, they went 12-2, beat Auburn in their bowl game. They're a team that, with their offense, with the majority of their production returning, with their defense as well, and with a workable schedule, they could win the American. I just have a greater faith in Cincinnati's staff and Cincinnati's talent level to where I think that Houston's going to go 11-2, and they're going to be the runner-ups in the American Conference. And finally, last but not least, as the 25th team is still much better than, I think, 105 or 106 maybe now other teams, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's issue is quarterback. It is solely quarterback. They get a good QB, they could win. They would be my favorites to win the Big Ten West, or at least a runner-up in the Big Ten West. They have a solid defense under Jim Leonard. Their offensive line will be one of the best in the nation. Their running back room will be one of the best in the nation. Wide receiver and quarterback is where their main questions reside, along with tight end, because they lost significant production at all those places, except for quarterback, and Graham Mertz stunk at quarterback this past season. We'll have to see how Bobby Engram does in his first year. Certainly him being hired shows that Paul Chryst and Wisconsin want to progress, or at least get back to where they were previously, which was better on offense. So that shows that Paul Chryst still has awareness, he wants to change, and that's a sign of a good head coach. Paul Chryst is once again one of those who has been able to do more with less, and in the past few seasons, outside of this past one, he's brought in some solid recruiting classes. That is all I have to say for this video. That right there, some teams went over a minute, especially some of the final teams, like some of the lower ranked ones, because I wanted to discuss some of their weaknesses. A lot of the top tier teams don't necessarily have a whole lot of weaknesses. It just depends on who's better. Like Ohio State and Michigan, for example, since I have a lot of Ohio State and Michigan fans. Ohio State versus Michigan, neither of those two teams have a lot of glaring weaknesses. They don't. It's just Ohio State is better in the offensive arena and returns more on defense, to where overall they just have more talent, more experience, and those two things matter. And I think for now they still do have the better head coach. It'll be interesting to see how that game, which I think will be the game of the year, seeing that Ohio State will win the Big Ten, win the national title, and I think Michigan will be a top 4 team, even though I don't have them reaching the playoff. I think that's going to be one of the games of the year, if not the game of the year, just as a little side note. But that's all I have to say for this video. If you like this video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts once again on my top 25 down below. Thank you all for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.